Good afternoon, everyone. It is I, Glenn Kyle, here with the Northeast Georgia History Center, ready to share with our members a really cool little lesson about James Longstreet. Now, why in the world would the History Center pick such an obscure character as James Longstreet to do a live stream on? Turns out he moved here after the Civil War. He's actually buried here in Gainesville, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we need to establish some basic parameters about Longstreet. Some of you may have heard of him and know a lot about him. Some of you may not quite understand why he's such a big deal, but he actually is. So let's talk just a little bit about his early life. He was born in the Edgefield district of South Carolina, which, by the way, is one of the world-famous areas for pottery, the same as Northeast Georgia is. We're sort of connected in that way as well. When he was fairly young, he was sent to Augusta, Georgia to live with his aunt and uncle, mostly because the opportunities for social advancement and education were better there in Augusta. And he attended the Richmond School and had some adventures there. He did eventually go to West Point. This is one of the places that he is most well known for. He does become primarily a military character in broader U.S. history. But we're not going to listen to me talk about his early life. We actually were able to meet with a fellow named Richard Pilcher, who is the head of the Longstreet Society, which is headquartered here in Gainesville. So let's go look at this interview with Richard and find out more about the early days of James Longstreet. All right, everyone, we are very glad and happy to be here at the Piedmont Hotel, home of the Longstreet Society, and the resident expert in Gainesville for James Longstreet, Mr. Richard Pilcher. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's always a pleasure. I always enjoy it.
So we want to talk to him. Lots of people know he was a Confederate general. Lots of people know that the Longstreet did a lot of interesting things in his life. But a man like that has to get to where he's at somehow. And so we've come to the expert, Richard here. Richard, can you tell us a little bit about his early life and those formative years, at least what we know?
Well, let me mention first something about his later life. His reputation took a dive about 5 years after the war, right about the time General Lee died. The reason for that, for a long time, his family didn't want to admit it and all that, but General Longstreet took up the cause of equal rights, and that pretty well ruined him in the South. So suddenly, instead of being the best of the battlefield commanders during the war, he was the guy that lost the war and all this sort of stuff. But what we're primarily talking about today is his childhood and his education. That too has been sort of twisted around, and with a lot of help from a man named Clark Thornton in Cleveland, who was General Longstreet's great-great-grandson, and is sort of the Longstreet family historian. Clark first gave me a tip that we were telling the wrong story about General Longstreet's upbringing. He gave me a little bit of detail, and Gordon Sawyer came by and told me about this book he was going to write, and I gave Gordon a tip that Clark had given me. So Gordon took off to Summerville, Alabama, and spent about a month over there, and he just dug up the whole story. And it's quite different from what we had been hearing all this time. He lived with his family in Augusta, and he did not live in Cleveland. And here's
we're talking about Cleveland, Georgia, folks, by the way, not Cleveland, Ohio.
Here's the trick. General Longstreet's older brother William had a farm in Cleveland, and they didn't actually do much farming either. They were coal mining up there. But William had a farm up there, and William had a son named James Carter Longstreet. And this is where the error started. Some historian 150 years ago assumed that James Carter Longstreet was later to be General Longstreet, when James Carter was our General Longstreet's nephew. But the story started there, and it just has never stopped. And there are people who will swear that James Longstreet grew up in Cleveland, Georgia, and he was sent to Augusta to live with his uncle Augustus during the school year so he could go to school at Richmond Academy. And that's the story of James Carter Longstreet, but not General Longstreet. He lived in Augusta to start with. Lived with his mother and his father. And then his father, while James Longstreet, I'm going to start calling him General James Longstreet. While General James Longstreet, although he was a little boy, while he lived with his parents, his father bought a farm in Alabama, in Morgan County, Alabama, and moved the family over there. Now, when they got to Alabama, they enrolled their children, or the boys, in the Summerville Male Academy, which was a school of great reputation in Alabama. General Longstreet went to school there, until his father died, and his mother moved the family back to Augusta, primarily to take care of his business and personal property affairs. Took her a couple of years. When she got that done, she moved back to Summerville with her children, and that's where General Longstreet finished school at the Summerville Male Academy. Now, while they were in Augusta, it's assumed that he attended Richmond Academy. Now, the Richmond Academy has lost their records. They can't prove he was there, but there was only one other school in Augusta at the time, and it was affiliated with a church to which the Longstreets didn't belong. General Longstreet's uncle Augustus was on the board of trustees of Richmond Academy, so I think it's a pretty good assumption that he did attend school there. Richmond Academy is comfortable enough with it. They put him in the first class of their Hall of Fame, but still with no proof that he actually attended there. But we've everybody involved has agreed that he attended school at Richmond Academy when they were in Augusta. And he went to Summerville Male Academy when they were in Alabama. Now, he graduated from Summerville Male Academy, and Gordon went over there and went to the school system in Morgan County, Alabama, and they produced his records while he was there. They have all the records. Graduated from Summerville Male Academy. This story we've heard about Uncle Augustus had so much political influence he could get an Alabama West Point appointment for a Richmond Academy graduate. That's all bogus. The appointment came from the congressman in his home district in Morgan County, Alabama, and just like it always happens, it was his congressman got him that appointment. He went to West Point. That's the story.
So, do we know, based on any research that's been done, what inspired him to take up a military career and go to West Point?
Well, he and his father decided, I guess, about the age you would consider you would be a freshman in high school. And about that age, he and his father decided on a military career for him. I suspect his father decided that, but it was about that age, and he was working towards that from that point on.
So he gets his appointment to West Point, and he attends. Tell us a little bit about his experiences at West Point. How did he do in class rankings? How many demerits did he get? What kind of West Pointer was he?
Well, he was not a great student. He was good on the military side. He loved, as he said, horseback riding and the outdoor sport of football, which we determined was neither soccer nor football as we know it. Not sure what that was, but we're working on that. He got some demerits at one point for disobedience of orders, and he brought a whole group of cadets to the commandant's office to testify that was not true, that it was unjust. And he found out years later, after the Civil War, that those demerits were still on his record, and he protested it again, tried to get them removed. And that's he didn't have really any disciplinary problems. He wasn't a great student. He was just sort of in the middle.
Well, his experiences in the military certainly speak to the fact that maybe grades at West Point aren't everything in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, well, you can say that about most college degrees. It's just the discipline required to get through college is the valuable part of it. And I think that was the case with General Longstreet, because he immediately, once he was in the military and once he had reached a rank where he had some authority, he started changing some things he had been taught at West Point. They had just become out of date, and he did a pretty good job of that, whereas some of his comrades in arms never learned that they needed to change some of the things they were doing. I don't like to be critical of Robert E. Lee because I'm a big fan, but the idea of putting 13,000 men on foot crossing a mile-long open field into cannon fire and rifle fire is just not a good idea. The rifled musket had made that an obsolete notion, and they suffered greatly for that. According to Pickett, when it came down to the time to start that, General Longstreet was sitting on a fence with tears rolling down his face. He knew what was coming, and he couldn't stop it.
His experiences at West Point, obviously you meet a lot of classmates along the way and you spend a lot of time. Were there any of his fellow students at West Point that he forged lifelong relationships with and friendships?
Well, there were a number. Practically every Civil War general, it seems, was a friend of his at West Point. Grant was probably his best friend at West Point, U.S. Grant. You see, General Lee and General Grant, when they met on April 9th of 1865, they agreed that a surrender was in order and they should come up with the terms. And they talked about terms and sort of agreed on a general idea. And then each appointed 3 officers to meet the next day to work up the official terms of surrender. Longstreet led the Confederate group. When he went to that meeting at the McLean house, he walked in the McLean house and heard a voice over in the corner say, "Hey, Pete, you need a cigar?" And he knew right away that was Grant. Pete was his nickname, by the way. So he said he talked for about half an hour with Grant there, and he said, "I left there that meeting a happy man. My friendship with Grant had been restored, and I had a pocket full of cigars." And he was a big cigar smoker and had been without cigars for a couple of weeks maybe. If you go to Longstreet's grave today, you always find cigars that people have left there for him.
You've been studying Longstreet for so long, and his story has been such a central part of your life. If you want people to take away one thing from Longstreet's life, from his experiences, from his beliefs, what do you want that to be?
1961, I walked into a military history class at North Georgia College, and the instructor said, "I don't know what you might have heard of James Longstreet. Just forget it because it's probably not true. And we're going to talk about James Longstreet this quarter." And the first thing he told us was that James Longstreet was one of the few officers in the Civil War who was willing to depart from the dogma when it became obvious that you need to change it. So I guess the main thing that maybe if I were talking to a young Army officer today, I would say in your career, don't be afraid to change things, because the situation will change and it'll be disastrous to stick to the old ways. That should do it.
That'll do it.
I think so.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Absolutely. You're the expert. You're the go-to guy for Longstreet, so we'll probably be in touch again soon. And folks, if you get a chance, when you come to Gainesville, Georgia, I know many of you are planning trips as we speak, please be sure to stop by the Piedmont Hotel, stop in and see Richard. There's a rich history of an incredible man here to see.
So thanks, Richard, for that. So that's sort of brings us up to his early life, some of his West Point days. Richard touched on some of the other things, and you'll hear more about that later. But I did want to mention one thing and sort of drive it home about his experience at West Point. The folks who went to West Point during this time are the names that just are writ large across the American Civil War. They were roommates, they were buddies, they found themselves on opposite sides. As a matter of fact, there was a fellow by the name of Rosecrans who was Longstreet's roommate while they were together at West Point. I want you to remember that name because a weird twist of fate comes up with Rosecrans a little bit later. But yes, important also to remember that Ulysses Grant and Longstreet become very close friends, which becomes quite tragic when the American Civil War approaches, but we're not there yet. So once he graduates from West Point, what is his early military career? As with most graduates of West Point in these days, in the 1830s and 40s and times like that, it's fairly uneventful. The United States Army is very small, actually. It is spread out all across the country. It's only about 18,000 men and officers, so not very large at all. It's that way on purpose because armies are expensive. And what they're doing is they're sort of either defending the coast or they're on the frontier, sort of watching out for conflicts with Native Americans and things like that. So in his first posting, Longstreet gets posted to Missouri to the Jefferson Barracks, which is still there today. And this is a photograph of a little bit later time, but that central area, that the building there with the central courtyard, that's more or less the original buildings that Longstreet would have been in. And later on, Grant also gets posted to the 4th U.S. Infantry there, and they continue to be good friends. They meet women at this time. Actually, Grant marries a lady named Julia Dent, who is Longstreet's, I believe, 3rd cousin or 4th cousin, and James Longstreet attends Grant's wedding at this point. And so really the early military career of these men is filled with guard duty and post and filling out forms and just sort of sitting on the edge of the frontier, not doing a lot of necessarily military battlefield things until the Mexican War comes along. And the story of how the Mexican War comes along and the overall story of the Mexican War is too much for us to cover here. But suffice to say that those West Point graduates we were just talking about, this is really the training ground. This is where they learn what it is to actually be in an army on a campaign, how to organize men, how to organize supplies. They take examples from the leaders of these armies, such as Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. And under the tutelage of these great soldiers, they learned the true operational art, as we say in military history. And, what sort of things was Longstreet specifically involved in? Well, Longstreet is a regular Army officer. He comes along as a lieutenant. And during the Mexican War, the first landing there, the first battle he takes place in is the Battle of Palo Alto. And you can see in this really interesting image, this is what a soldier and an officer would have looked like during the Mexican War. So the fellow, let me make sure I'm looking at this right. Yes, the fellow on the left is the officer, the lighter blue fellow with the white cross belts. These are the infantrymen. Now they're going to be on campaign. They're going to start looking a little sloppier and a little messed up from this, but this is how the men are going to look at this time. Longstreet probably didn't have a beard at this time because it wasn't the military fashion to have a beard, believe it or not. So he fights in the Battle of Palo Alto. He fights at Resaca del Palma, Monterrey, and at Churubusco. And following the campaigns through the landing, the Winfield Scott, what he's trying to do is get to Mexico City so that they can, on the Mexican nations on ground, defeat them. And Chapultepec is a citadel, is a castle within Mexico City, and in the final assault that the U.S. Army makes, this is the one that everyone wants to be at. This is the battle that determines the war. And so Longstreet is leading his men in a charge up to Chapultepec, and he is wounded in this action. He has actually grabbed the American flag and is carrying it forward to rally his men. And as he is wounded, he passes that flag off to one of his fellow officers, George Pickett. That name is also going to come up a little bit later, I assure you. But from his wound, he recovers from that wound, obviously. The Mexican War ends with a massive American victory, and the territories that are gained by the United States from the Mexican War, in effect, lead us down the path towards the American Civil War, because the real question is, what are all these new territories? Are they going to become slave states or free states? It really sets the United States on a course to civil war. But again, we're not there yet. So after the Mexican War and in the interwar years, Longstreet again sort of bounces around from pillar to post, rising very, very slowly in rank. And this is the thing to remember. During the Mexican War, these U.S. Army officers are getting brevet promotions or battlefield promotions, which means they're going up to they're starting off as lieutenants, and because of the men coming in, because of the larger command duties they have, they're getting kicked up to majors and captains and majors and even lieutenant colonels. Well, after the war is over, they all sort of go back down, and it's very hard to get a promotion in the peacetime army. And Longstreet himself, he's married at this time to his first wife, and continues on in the military. And he is actually stationed out west when the rumblings of the war begins. It's interesting, from what we know of Longstreet before the war, he's rather unpolitical. He doesn't seem to hold that many strong political opinions. So what is it that makes him, as the war approaches, become a Confederate officer? What is it that makes him resign his commission as a United States officer and join the Confederacy? We're not exactly sure. It seems to be, rather than a belief in a slavocracy, it seems to be, as Lee explained for himself, going along with his state and going along with the places where he's from. He is a Southerner. He was born in South Carolina, more or less raised in Georgia, spent a lot of time in Alabama, so he has an affinity for that part of the country and the people who live there. So he resigns from the Army and is actually sent to Richmond. The Confederacy desperately needs experienced military men in this time, because unlike the U.S. Army, the Confederate Army is starting with nothing, right? They're having to build every single thing from scratch. And knowing this, the Confederate States actually pass America's first draft law and begin drafting men into the Confederate Army. Longstreet is sent to Richmond to help Jefferson Davis sort of arrange and figure out how the law is going to work and where the men are going to go and things like that. At this time, because there's so many people coming into a smaller area than they had, this happens during wars, a rash of scarlet fever breaks out. And Scarlet fever sweeps through the Longstreet home, and he and his wife had actually had 10 children. 6 had died young or in childbirth, and of the 4 remaining, 3 died during this scarlet fever, leaving only James Longstreet's son Garland as the sole survivor of those 10. So this fantastic tragedy that Longstreet goes through with his wife seems to change him. They said that, before this he was very jovial, that there were sort of a party spirit at his headquarters. He would drink whiskey and things like that. But after this, he became much more serious, became much more religious. But with the Confederacy needing these men, of course, they realized that Longstreet has experience, not only in terms of organizing men, but in battlefield command. That is the most important thing. And so he is very quickly promoted to be a general in the field. He's promoted to be a brigadier and eventually works his way up. He's a brigadier general during the first Battle of Manassas, the first main battle, and serves well. And, this is, I'm not going to go through the battle of the Civil War, the battles of the Civil War. I just want to touch on these. But Longstreet performs very, very well in every battle that he's in. And because the Confederacy is looking for able commanders, he keeps getting nudged up a little bit more and more. So he becomes a division commander after Manassas. And then during the Peninsular Campaign, which is where McClellan comes in and is trying to get to Richmond, the forces under Joseph Johnston stop him. And Joseph Johnston is wounded during these battles, and his replacement is a fellow named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee sort of knows Longstreet, knows Pete, and puts him in larger command. And for much of the rest of this campaign, simply by chance, Longstreet is commanding about half of Lee's army as one of the corps commanders. CORPS, by the way. And so Lee continues to place Longstreet in command during these times, and Lee's command structure of the Army of Northern Virginia is very unorthodox. The Union armies have 5 or 6 or 8 corps that under the overall commander, he can send commands and have a lot of division of command so that he's having to do this. Under Lee, the Army of Northern Virginia, until Gettysburg, only has 2 corps. One is commanded by Stonewall Jackson, the other commanded by James Longstreet. So Longstreet becomes a central and important part of Lee's victories through the war. This is where he gets the name the Old War Horse, because Lee knows he can always count on Longstreet to be stolid and be dependable. He may not have that spark of genius on the offensive the way Stonewall Jackson does, but if you give Pete a job, Pete's going to do the job. And he shows that at Antietam, he shows that at Fredericksburg, and he shows that at Chancellorsville. I want to give one little, perhaps pejorative to Longstreet. As Richard noted, Longstreet loved cigars. And there's the story of the Lost Order at Antietam. This order basically gave all of Lee's plans. It was from Lee's headquarters, and it gave Lee's plans for the movements of the entire army, and it was found in a field by a Union private. People think that order was probably carelessly lost by James Longstreet because it was wrapped in a bundle of cigars. James Longstreet is the only person who smoked a lot of cigars who would have had an order that secret and that high up. So not a good job, Pete. You got to watch that Antietam stuff, which leads to a loss for the Confederacy. But they hold on. They go to Fredericksburg, have an overwhelming victory in December of 1862, and then moving on, the new year begins, and the spring offensive by Lee marches north into Pennsylvania. And at Chancellorsville, the Confederacy has a great victory. Longstreet holds the army here while Jackson goes around their flank. However, Jackson is killed in this battle. And as a result, Lee decides to divide his army into 3 corps, with Longstreet commanding 1 and 2 others being commanded by other men, which happens just before the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this is probably what most people think of. This is what Richard was talking about with Longstreet at Gettysburg. Long story short, on the first day, the armies begin to come close to each other, and the lines sort of start to gel. And you can see in this map, on the second day, this map is from the third day. On the second day, Longstreet is in command on the Confederate right, and he keeps trying to go around the Union army, but Lee won't let him go too far. Lee believes in a strong, direct attack. Longstreet's not as big a fan of this, but he's following orders. And on the third day, Lee makes the decision to strike at the Union center with everything he has left. And he can't trust his two new corps commanders to do that. He wants to give it to his old warhorse, Pete. Longstreet knows that this attack is not going to succeed. As Richard said, it's 13,000 men, 13,000 of the best soldiers that have ever been on the American continent, but they're having to cross a mile of open ground against cannon and rifle fire, and that's going to take them about 20 minutes. Longstreet knows that this will not succeed, and yet he is placed in command to assure it. And this is called, of course, Pickett's Charge, because George E. Pickett is in the lead of this attack, the same person that handed Longstreet the flag way back when at Chapultepec. And Pickett's Charge is under Longstreet's overall command. It is a failure. Many Confederates are killed or wounded that day, and this results in the loss of Gettysburg for the Confederates, and they are forced to retreat southward, something Longstreet knew all along. But we'll get a little bit more into the controversy about the orders that were given on the third day of Gettysburg. However, the war is by no means over after Gettysburg, and Lee has a plan to reinforce General Bragg in the west, and he sends Longstreet and a significant number of Confederate soldiers via the railroads out west to Georgia. And again, I won't get into the Chickamauga campaign, but suffice to say, near Chattanooga, Bragg has a chance to attack the Union Army under Rosecrans. Remember Rosecrans, Longstreet's roommate? Well, Rosecrans is in command, and because of a command blunder, a hole opens up in the Union line that's about 200 or 300 yards wide. In other words, there's no Union soldiers there at all. That happens to be the place that Longstreet's Virginians, who have reinforced from Lee, drive straight through at a place called the Brotherton Cabin. You can see a picture of this here from Chickamauga Battlefield. This drive by Longstreet's men literally splits the Union Army in two. Rosecrans jumps on his horse and takes off riding as fast as he can for Chattanooga. And this army totally defeats the Union Army, and it is a total Confederate victory. The problem is Bragg, the commander in the West, doesn't exactly know how to take advantage of a victory that Longstreet has won. He doesn't follow through. And Lee very quickly begins to miss Longstreet and recalls him back to the east. So Longstreet comes out west, has a great victory at Chickamauga, and then goes back out to the east and goes back into winter quarters with Lee. Well, this brings us to the early part of 1864. This is probably the longest year of the war. And I'm not going to go into all the details in the battles, but at this point, the Confederacy and those in higher leadership, such as Longstreet, realized that the cause is more or less lost, and simply going on fighting is not going to assure victory, but this is what they do. They're soldiers, and the government won't give up. And so 1864 drags on. This is the time when Longstreet's old friend, Ulysses Simpson Grant, is placed in charge of Union forces in Virginia, and so this is the great Grant versus Lee time. Longstreet knows that his old best. I want you to think about all of us have a best friend, and I want you to think about what it would be like if you and your best friend were on opposite sides of America's bloodiest conflict. You're supposed to do everything you can to win, but in winning, you're going to absolutely cripple the best friends you've ever had, and this has to be heartrending, not just for Grant and Longstreet, but for everyone involved. I just want to bring that home for a moment. The war goes on in 1864. There is no clear-cut victory for either side, but it's very obvious the Union's overwhelming resources and Grant's strategies are going to lead to victory. So in spring of 1865, the Confederacy finally falls. Richmond is evacuated, and General Lee sues for terms, as Richard was talking about. And on that second day, Longstreet finally goes into the McLean house and sees his old buddy Grant. I would have loved to have heard what they talked about for that 30 minutes. It would have been something incredibly remarkable. So the war ends, and Longstreet goes home. Longstreet, this is one of the more interesting things about him as opposed to other Confederate generals. He begins to fight for the unity of the nation. He wants the country, as Lincoln did, to come back together, to put their differences aside and move forward as a unified group. he also turns out to be quite an egalitarian. He moves to New Orleans and takes up a job as a railroad man and a postmaster and things like that. He's then, for a short time, under the presidency of Ulysses Grant, by the way, named ambassador to Turkey, of all things. So he serves as an ambassador to Turkey because they're buddies. This friendship with Grant, because Grant becomes president, he's the president for most of Reconstruction. Longstreet gets a lot of grief because his old buddy is now president of the United States. And then Longstreet takes actions, as Richard hinted at, that made him the pariah of true Southerners, right? First of all, he joins the Republican Party. The Republican Party of Lincoln, of Grant, the ones who agitated to free the slaves during the war. This is the political party he joins. Because he's a Republican, because his friend is in the White House, he gets a lot of post and privileges. He tells people we've got to learn to live together and we've got to give the African Americans a chance to be equal. When he's in New Orleans during Reconstruction, as you can imagine, there's a lot of resistance to black people having an equal say and equal rights. And as a result, they form a local militia against aggressive white Southerners who want to put them down. Guess who takes command of this black militia? James Longstreet. They ask him to be in command, and he says, absolutely, I will do so. This makes everybody back down, but it also puts in their head, who does Longstreet think he is? He seems to be a traitor to the cause now. And then he gets a lot of grief. He writes his memoirs, and to sort of settle things and to bring his reputation back, because people were starting to blame him for the loss at Gettysburg. You didn't push the attack enough. Remember, Gettysburg is supposed to be the great Confederate moment when Confederate victory could have been assured, but it wasn't. Why wasn't it? Because of that Longstreet. He didn't attack the way he was supposed to. So to sort of counter this, he writes his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he does the thing you can't do. He blamed General Lee. You can't blame General Lee for things. Lee is the quasi-god of the Confederacy, and he is infallible, and he blamed Lee. So this was the final nail in Longstreet's coffin. This was it. People were done with him. He was a scalawag. He was a Republican. He was a sympathizer and a compatriot of the president, and he took up with African Americans when they were trying to be violent, and now he speaks poorly of Lee. So Longstreet's reputation is mud. Nobody likes him. So he decides to kind of put it all to the side, and he moves to Gainesville, Georgia. Not a mile and a half from this very spot where I sit did he build a home. He brought his wife there. He invested, and you can see this is the Piedmont Hotel as it originally was. He invested in this hotel that was just across the street from the railroad depot. It became very popular. It became very lucrative. And Longstreet actually has a pretty successful life. The rest of the South may hate Longstreet, but we people here in Gainesville loved him because, look, a famous person has come to live with us. This is kind of cool. And he certainly stood out when he walked down the street. People, I want you to look at those whiskers on his face. Right? This is how he looked in his later years. And his wife unfortunately passes when he lives here. He lives for a few years and then finds another. At the age of 70-something, I can't remember, he marries a 34-year-old Helen Dortch, who becomes Helen Dortch Longstreet. And the two actually seem to have a very, very happy marriage together. We've got a great photo of them together here. Helen Dortch, Georgia native, she went to Brenau Academy here. Not Brenau Academy. It was the Georgia Baptist Women's Seminary College when she went to it. And so they lived very happily here. And tragically, however, his home did burn down. It's very interesting. When you go to the Museum of the Confederacy or you see things like that, you will see, Lee's hat and coat and Pickett's coat and Jeb Stuart's coat and things like that. You will see nothing of Longstreet's, because all of Longstreet's letters, all of his war memorabilia, and his remembrances burned up in that fire here in Gainesville. So none of that is left to celebrate. He lives the rest of his life out in Gainesville, and he dies in January of 1904 aged 83. The last several years of his life, his health had definitely gone downhill. He had respiratory issues. He got cancer in one of his eyes. He had a hard time getting around. But he was buried here in Gainesville. It was a very big to-do, and this picture is actually of part of his grave markers. His grave marker is very interesting. I don't have a in the round picture of it, but you can see here it talks about his military. It points out that his military service to the United States lasted far longer than his service to the Confederacy, and he never renounced either one for that matter. And on one side, it actually has from Palo Alto to Chapultepec. On the other side, it has from Manassas to Appomattox Courthouse. So he's commemorating all of his military service, all of his wartime service. He's buried there. When Helen Longstreet died many, many years later, she is buried there as well. And as Richard said, it's a place people come to see. And it's interesting, people come and put their Confederate flags and U.S. flags there, but flying at his gravesite night and day, lit electronically, is an American flag. And I think that's the way Longstreet definitely would have wanted it. So what is Longstreet's legacy? As I said, from the time shortly after the war ended until really almost the 1980s, in the South, he was either forgotten, or if he was remembered, he was remembered very harshly as a traitor to his cause, as the person who tried to blame Lee for his own failings and things like that. There were no statues of Longstreet put up anywhere in that time period. We don't need to get into the issue of Confederate statues and them going up when they did or coming down when they did, but that's in the news. Some of you have probably kept up with that, but there was no Longstreet statue put up anywhere until the 1980s. Well, what changed? It's very interesting. A book by the name of Killer Angels by Michael Shara was released. This became an incredible bestseller, and it was even turned into a really good movie called Gettysburg. And in it, Shara has basically set up the Battle of Gettysburg as a narrative. It's almost historic fiction, except everything in it happened except for the exact phrasing of the conversations. And in this, Shara takes a very sympathetic view of General Longstreet. He's definitely done his research. He's looked at things differently, and because of that book and the subsequent very popular movie, since the 1980s, people have really started to see Longstreet in a different light. He's almost the good Confederate now, right? With so many issues that we've had with post-war behavior of Confederate generals and the very cause for which the Confederacy fought, when people begin to look at Longstreet and especially his post-war activities, he turns out to be a pretty respectable person, someone who, even with our backwards-looking modern morals, does not seem to be that problematic. Not that I'm a fan of judging the past by modern morals, but if we were to do that, Longstreet's a pretty cool guy, and as a result, his reputation has very much been rehabilitated in the last 20 or 30 years, to the point where they even put a statue up of him at Gettysburg. That's the one over there on the other side, and the one that I'm pointing at right here. Very, very recently, they put this statue up at his old home site here in Gainesville. So he's starting to get a little bit of his due. I could be wrong, I haven't heard anyone suggest we tear down Longstreet's statues or anything like that. So Longstreet definitely is a very interesting character, not just for his wartime legacy and military history within the Civil War, which is fascinating, but his post-war life, I think, is even more fascinating. And yes, I'm saying that as a Gainesvillian because he lived here and he's buried here, but what a fascinating character. There's so much more we can go into, but we can't. But if you're interested in it, please go visit the Longstreet Society here in Gainesville. If it's a little too far away for you to visit, please go to their website, and we've got their website link here. They are a great bunch of people. They're the experts, not myself. Stop by and see Richard sometime or go on their website. As a matter of fact, I think they're planning their annual conference very soon, which is actually this year going to be held in Gettysburg. So you may want to take a look at that and see what else there is to learn about James Longstreet. I don't know how much time we have left, but I want to thank all of you for joining us. This has been a fantastic journey about a fantastic individual, And as always, thank you, our members, for making programs like this possible. The History Center couldn't be around without you. So, until we can see you again at the History Center or online, stay safe and take care.